The text message arrived at 3:17 a.m. on the night my father passed away. Emma, I need you to stop digging. What happened at Meridian stays at Meridian. Rebecca knows you've been asking questions. She's furious. I stared at my phone in disbelief, the sterile hospital corridor suddenly feeling even colder. My father's body was still warm in the room behind me, the machines only recently silenced. Harold Wilson, the man who had taught me everything I knew about financial integrity, about standing up for what's right, was gone. And here was my own husband, Daniel, warning me to stay silent about the fraud I'd accidentally discovered 3 weeks ago. I clutched my father's worn leather portfolio, the one he'd carried through 40 years as a forensic accountant, and felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Dad had spent his life following money trails and exposing corporate corruption. The numbers never lie, Emma, he always said. People lie, systems lie. But if you follow the numbers patiently, they'll always lead you to the truth. I took a screenshot of Daniel's message, then typed 7 words that would change everything. I'm not digging, I'm about to excavate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months ago, I was Emma Thompson, devoted wife, occasional, charity fundraiser, and former senior financial analyst who'd willingly stepped away from my career to support my husband's rise at Meridian Health Solutions. My life revolved around hosting dinner parties for Daniel's colleagues, maintaining our showcase home in Lakeside's most prestigious neighborhood, and playing the perfect corporate spouse to a man whose ambition seemed to be taking him straight to the executive suite. What no one saw, beneath the carefully curated exterior, was the gradual erosion of my identity. I had once been the rising star at Appleton Financial, known for spotting irregularities others missed. I'd planned to return to work once Daniel was established, but somehow that moment never seemed to arrive. First, it was after the Watson merger, then after Rebecca's restructuring, then after the IPO launch. Meanwhile, my financial expertise was redirected toward planning Daniel's networking events and organizing charity galas, where Rebecca Thompson, Meridian's CEO, could cultivate the company's image as a healthcare innovator with a conscience. The transformation had been so gradual, I barely noticed it happening. Daniel initially sought my insights on financial matters, valuing my analytical mind. Then he began presenting my observations as his own in meetings. Eventually, he stopped asking altogether, suggesting that my thinking was too conservative. For Meridian's aggressive growth strategy, Rebecca encouraged this dynamic. Emma, you're so lucky you don't have to worry about quarterly projections anymore, she'd say at company gatherings, champagne flute in hand. Daniel tells me you've become quite the event planner. Perhaps you could help with our donor gala. Next month? I always smiled and agreed, ignoring the subtle diminishment. After all, Daniel was thriving. We were building a future together, or so I thought. The first crack in the facade appeared during a dinner party I hosted for Meridian's executive team. I was in the kitchen plating desserts when I overheard Rebecca speaking to James Peterson, the CFO. The Westlake numbers don't add up, James murmured. If anyone looks closely at those trial results, no one will, Rebecca interrupted. The regulatory team has been handled. Besides, by the time anyone could possibly raise questions, we'll have secured the government contracts. Just make sure the Q3 projections reflect what investors expect to see, not what the actual data suggests. And if someone notices the discrepancy? Rebecca's laugh was soft but chilling. Who would notice? Emma's the only one who ever caught our accounting maneuvers, and Daniel made sure she's too busy selecting flower arrangements to look at balance sheets. I stood frozen, the delicate chocolate soufflés forgotten in my hands, the casual confidence with which Rebecca discussed manipulating data, the easy way she dismissed me. But most devastating was Daniel's apparent role in keeping me distracted and uninformed. That night, after everyone left, I said nothing to Daniel about what I'd overheard. Instead, I waited until he fell asleep, then used his laptop to access his Meridian email. His password was still my birthday, followed by my mother's maiden name. Within an hour, I found references to Project Westlake and clinical trial data that had been altered to show Meridian's new healthcare management system, reducing hospital errors by 46%, when the actual figure was closer to 12%. The implications were staggering. Meridian was on the verge of securing contracts worth billions based on falsified efficacy data. If implemented nationwide, their system would appear to save lives while potentially putting thousands of patients at risk due to its actual underperformance. I couldn't confront Daniel immediately. I needed more information, more evidence, and I needed to be careful. So I began my investigation quietly, using skills I'd developed during my financial career, but had allowed to go dormant during my years as Daniel's supportive spouse. For 2 weeks, I gathered fragments of information. I reconnected with former colleagues under the guise of considering returning to the workforce. I volunteered to organize Rebecca's office files during a company retreat, photographing key documents while everyone was attending team-building exercises. I was careful, methodical, and patient until my father's sudden heart attack 3 days ago. As I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand during his final hours, I confided in him, telling him everything I'd discovered. "Dad, I don't know what to do. The fraud is massive. People could die if this system gets implemented nationally. But if I come forward, I'll destroy Daniel's career, our marriage, everything." My father, even weakened by heart failure, fixed me with the steady gaze I'd known all my life. "Emma," he whispered, "you already know what to do. You're just afraid to do it." He died that night. And then came Daniel's text, the message that told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties truly lay. The morning after my father's death, I drove to his small apartment instead of returning home. I needed space to think, to plan, to decide my next steps. Dad had lived modestly despite his successful career, believing that excessive wealth often compromised integrity. His apartment was simple but comfortable, filled with books on finance, ethics, and justice. The perfect place to clear my head. I made coffee in his old percolator and sat at his desk, opening his leather portfolio. Inside, I found his case notes from decades of investigations, meticulously organized. But tucked into the front pocket was something unexpected. A business card for Sophia Martinez, investigative reporter, the Lakeside Observer, with my father's handwriting on the back. Called about Meridian, May 12th. Trustworthy. My father had been investigating Meridian, too. The realization both shocked and comforted me. Dad had always had an uncanny intuition about corporate misconduct. And apparently, he'd already taken the first step toward exposing what he'd found. My phone had been buzzing with messages from Daniel all morning. "Where are you? Come home so we can talk." "Emma, I'm worried about you. This isn't the time to make rash decisions. Rebecca needs to know you won't complicate things. She's prepared to be generous." The last message confirmed everything. Rebecca was already offering a payoff for my silence, which meant they were genuinely afraid of what I knew. I ignored all the messages and called Sophia Martinez instead. "Ms. Martinez? My name is Emma Wilson. Harold Wilson was my father. I believe he contacted you about Meridian Health Solutions." There was a brief pause. "Yes, he did. I'm so sorry for your loss. The obituary was in this morning's paper." "Thank you. I need to continue what he started. Do you have time to meet today?" 3 hours later, I sat across from Sophia at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, deliberately chosen for its distance from any Meridian offices. Sophia was younger than I expected, perhaps early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a recorder placed conspicuously between us. "Your father contacted me about potential financial irregularities at Meridian," she said after we'd Ordered. He was careful not to make specific allegations, but he mentioned creative accounting that went beyond the usual corporate window dressing. He said he had a source. That source was me, I admitted, though I didn't know he'd reached. Out to you. I discovered evidence of data manipulation in clinical trials for their healthcare management system. They've altered efficacy rates to secure government contracts. Sophia leaned forward. That's a serious accusation, especially for a company about to roll out a system that will impact patient care nationwide. Do you have proof? I hesitated. Fragments, documents that show discrepancies, emails hinting at deliberate misrepresentation. Not enough for a legal case, but enough to justify a deeper investigation. And you're willing to go on record? As a former employee and the wife of a current executive? The question made my situation suddenly, painfully clear. Coming forward wouldn't just mean betraying Daniel's trust. It would mean publicly positioning myself against my husband and the powerful company he served. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need to think about that, I replied honestly. But I can provide information, documentation. You can verify independently. Sophia studied me for a long moment. Mrs. Thompson. Wilson, I corrected automatically. I kept my maiden name. Professionally. Something shifted in Sophia's expression. A new respect, perhaps, for this small assertion of independent identity. Ms. Wilson, then, I understand your hesitation. But from what your father shared and what you're telling me, now this story has serious public health implications. If Meridian's system doesn't perform as advertised, people could die. I know, I said quietly. That's why I'm here. As I drove back to my father's apartment, my phone rang. Daniel again. This time I answered. Where are you? He demanded. I've been worried sick. I'm at my dad's place. I needed some time alone. You should be home, with me. We need to talk about everything. Yes, I agreed. We do, but not yet. I'm still processing Dad's death. Daniel's voice softened, though I could hear the calculation behind it. Of course, I understand. But Emma, about those questions you were asking. Rebecca's concerned about confidential information. Corporate espionage is a serious issue. Is that what she's calling it? Corporate espionage? A pause. What would you call it? Fraud investigation. The silence that followed told me everything. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice now clinically cool. You're emotional right now. Grieving, making accusations you can't support and don't fully understand. Come home. We'll talk through this rationally. I'll be home tomorrow, I lied. I just need one more night here. After hanging up, I turned off my phone's location services and began working. If Daniel and Rebecca were already framing me as emotionally unstable and potentially engaging in corporate espionage, I needed to protect myself. I spent the evening compiling everything I had gathered, organizing it the way my father had taught me, creating a clear narrative that even a non-financial expert could follow. The next morning, instead of going home, I went to see Marcus Chen, an attorney my father had worked with on whistleblower cases. His office was modest but immaculately maintained, with a view of the lake that gave the city its name. Ms. Wilson, he greeted me, rising from behind his desk. Your father was one of the finest men I knew. His integrity was unmatched. That's why I'm here, I replied. I need to make sure his last investigation isn't buried. I explained everything, the altered data, Rebecca's comments, Daniel's complicity, the potential impact on patient safety nationwide. Marcus listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. You understand what you're risking? He finally asked. Your marriage, certainly. Potentially your financial security. Meridian will paint you as a disgruntled former employee or an unstable spouse. I understand. And you're prepared to work with the SEC, possibly testify if this reaches that point? I thought of my father's unwavering commitment to truth, even when it was inconvenient or painful. I thought of the patients who would rely on a system designed to protect them but built on lies. Yes, I said firmly. I'm prepared. Marcus nodded. Then let's do this properly. Everything by the book, everything documented. If Meridian wants to come after you, they'll find themselves facing someone who knows exactly how their game is played. For the next week, I stayed in a hotel under my maiden name, paid for in cash. Marcus helped me prepare a formal whistleblower complaint for the SEC while Sophia began her own investigation, carefully developing sources within Meridian and the healthcare industry who could corroborate elements of my story without revealing I was her primary source. Daniel's messages grew increasingly frantic, then threatening. Rebecca's legal team is building a case against you for corporate theft. Come home now, or I'll report the car as stolen. They're saying you accessed systems illegally. They have logs, Emma. I forwarded each message to Marcus, who incorporated them into our growing file. They're getting desperate, he observed, which means you're on the right track. On the 8th day, I received an unexpected ally. Mia Johnson, Rebecca's administrative assistant, contacted Sophia after reading an oblique reference to healthcare monitoring systems in that morning's Observer. I know what's happening, she told Sophia during a meeting I observed from a distance. I've been managing Rebecca's communications about Project Westlake for months. The data manipulation isn't even subtle if you know where to look. With Mia's help, our case strengthened dramatically. She provided internal emails where Rebecca explicitly directed the research team to adjust the error rates to meet investor expectations. Most damning was a message exchange between Rebecca and Daniel discussing how to keep me specifically from looking too closely at the company's finances. Emma's always been too perceptive for her own good, Daniel had written. I'll make sure she stays focused on the house renovation instead of our books. Seeing those words in black and white, confirmation that my husband had deliberately distracted me from discovering his company's fraud, should have been devastating. Instead, it was clarifying. The man I had supported, loved, and trusted had systematically undermined me, using my respect for our marriage as a tool to silence my questions. 2 weeks after my father's death, the SEC opened a formal investigation into Meridian Health Solutions. The company's stock dropped 12% on the news alone. Rebecca called an emergency board meeting, and rumors of document shredding began circulating among lower-level employees. Then came the moment I hadn't fully prepared for. The Lakeside Observer published Sophia's first in-depth article on the investigation, featuring quotes from unnamed sources that detailed the specific ways Meridian had falsified its efficacy data. Though I wasn't identified, the article mentioned sources close to Meridian executives with direct knowledge of internal discussions. Daniel would know immediately it was me. Sure enough, within hours of the article's publication, he was at the door of my hotel room. "How did you find me?" I asked, not inviting him in. "You think I don't know your habits? When you're stressed, you seek out water views." His face was tight with anger. But there was something else there. Fear. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Exactly what my father would have expected of me," I replied calmly. "What's happening at Meridian isn't just creative accounting, Daniel. It's fraud that could cost lives." "It's business," he snapped. "Every company massages data to present the optimal story to investors and regulators." "Massages data?" They falsified clinical trials. They claimed a 46% reduction in medication errors when the real number is 12%. If hospitals nationwide implement a system based on those lies, patients will die, Daniel. Something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps. A moment of recognition. That this went beyond typical corporate malfeasance, but it passed quickly. "Rebecca is offering a deal," he said. "A generous settlement if you sign an NDA and retract your statements to the SEC. We could start over somewhere new, together." I studied the man I had married, seeing him now with painful clarity. There is no we anymore, Daniel. There probably hasn't been for a long time. You're really choosing this crusade, over our marriage. I'm choosing integrity over fraud, truth over convenience. The same choice I would have made if you'd ever actually asked me, instead of deliberately keeping me in the dark. Daniel's expression hardened. Rebecca was right about you. Always so righteous, so inflexible. Do you think anyone will thank you for this? Meridian employs thousands of people whose jobs are now at risk because you couldn't mind your own business. Patient safety is everyone's business. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. When this is over, and you're alone with your principals, I hope they keep you warm at night. As he walked away, I felt not grief, but a surprising lightness. For the first time in years, I was fully aligned with my values, fully present in my own life. The path ahead would be difficult, but it was undeniably mine. The 3 weeks that followed Daniel's confrontation at the hotel were a masterclass in corporate damage control and intimidation. Meridian's PR machine activated with military precision, issuing statements about disgruntled former employees and misleading media narratives taken out of context. Rebecca Thompson appeared on local business programs, her expression the perfect blend of concern and confidence as she assured investors that Meridian's healthcare management system exceeded all industry standards. What they didn't know was how thoroughly I had prepared for this exact response. Each morning, I woke in my hotel room and followed the same ritual my father had taught me years ago. I reviewed my evidence, cross-referenced new information from Sophia's sources, and documented every corporate statement that contradicted the facts. The familiar rhythm of financial analysis centered me, reconnecting me to the professional identity I had allowed to be slowly erased during my years as Daniel's wife. "They're scared," Marcus Chen said during our daily strategy call. Rebecca pushed the board to approve a $2 million increase to their legal defense fund yesterday. "How do you know that?" I asked, impressed by his intelligence network. "Olivia." Grant reached out to me privately. "She's on Meridian's board but has concerns about Rebecca's management. She's not ready to break ranks publicly, but she's watching closely." This was significant. Olivia was respected throughout the healthcare industry for her ethical leadership. If she was questioning Rebecca's decisions, others on the board might follow. Meanwhile, Sophia's investigation continued to uncover damning details. Through careful reporting, she discovered that Rebecca had pressured researchers to exclude certain patients from trial data when their outcomes didn't support Meridian's claims. More disturbingly, 2 hospital administrators who had raised concerns about the system's performance during early implementation had been silenced with generous consulting contracts and stringent confidentiality agreements. This goes beyond financial fraud, Sophia told me during one of our now regular meetings at the Botanical Gardens Cafe. We always sat at a secluded table near the orchid display, where the hushed atmosphere and limited foot traffic minimized the chance of being overheard. They're endangering patients for profit. The public deserves to know. I agreed, but timing was crucial. We needed to ensure the SEC investigation was sufficiently advanced before publishing anything that might alert Meridian to our specific evidence. If Rebecca knew exactly what we had, she might find ways to explain or obscure the most damaging documents. Daniel's approach shifted from confrontation to reconciliation. He sent flowers to my hotel room with notes expressing concern for my well-being. He left voicemails reminiscing about happier times in our marriage. When these tactics failed to elicit a response, he escalated to having mutual friends reach out, suggesting that I was making a grave mistake that would ruin not only Daniel's career, but my own reputation in the community. classic isolation technique, Marcus observed when I forwarded these messages to him. They're trying to make you feel like you're alone in this, that everyone else thinks you're wrong. I'm not alone, I replied, with more confidence than I had felt in years. My father's colleagues had been checking in regularly, offering both emotional support and professional insights. Sophia had become something between a colleague and a friend. And most surprisingly, several former co-workers from my financial analyst days had reached out after hearing rumors of my involvement in the Meridian investigation, expressing admiration for my courage. 26 days after my father's funeral, the first significant crack appeared in Meridian's defense. Dr. Andrew Clark, the company's medical director, resigned abruptly, citing irreconcilable differences regarding data interpretation and reporting standards. Though his statement was carefully worded to avoid legal repercussions, the timing spoke volumes. Sophia immediately sought an interview, but Andrew declined to comment beyond his official statement. However, through a series of discreet inquiries, she learned that he had been meeting with SEC investigators for several days before his resignation. He's talking, she confirmed. Multiple sources say he's provided documentation showing he raised concerns about the trial data months ago but was overruled by Rebecca. This was the breakthrough we had been waiting for. With Andrew's testimony, my evidence would no longer stand alone. The narrative was shifting from disgruntled wife to systematic corporate fraud. That evening, as I worked in my hotel room, organizing the latest information for Marcus, there was a soft knock at my door. I approached cautiously, having instructed the front desk not to reveal my room number to anyone. "Who is it?" I called through the door. "Mia Johnson, Rebecca's assistant. Please, I need to talk to you." I opened the door slightly, chain still engaged. Mia stood in the hallway, her normally impeccable appearance disheveled, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. "How did you find me?" I asked. "I followed Sofia Martinez here earlier this week. Please, I shouldn't be here, but you need to know what's happening." I let her in, watching as she nervously scanned the room, before sitting at the small desk chair. She pulled out her phone, placed it on the table, and played an audio recording. Rebecca's voice filled the room. "The SEC is moving faster than expected. We need to contain this immediately. Emma has to be discredited before she can testify." Daniel responded, "I've tried talking to her. She won't listen." "Then we move to the contingency plan," Rebecca said coldly. "Finance found those discrepancies in her work from 4 years ago. We'll leak them to the media, suggest she was fired for incompetence rather than resigning to support your career. James has doctored the HR records already." "That's a dangerous game," Daniel cautioned. "Emma kept meticulous records." "And where are those records now? In your house, accessible to you. Find her documentation and remove anything that contradicts our narrative." The recording ended, and Mia looked at me with genuine fear. "They're planning to break into your house tonight to alter your personal records. And there's more. Rebecca has hired a private investigator to follow you, looking for anything they can use against you." My mind raced. Most of my important documents were with Marcus or secured in a safe deposit box, but there were still files in my home office. That could be valuable to our case. And the idea that Daniel would willingly break into my files, our home, felt like yet another betrayal, even after everything that had happened. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Mia. "You're putting yourself at risk." She twisted, her hands in her lap. "My mother was harmed by a medication error last year, exactly the kind of error Meridian's system claims to prevent but doesn't. When I realized what they were doing, how they were lying about the efficacy..." She shook her head. "I can't be part of it anymore." I made a quick decision. I need to get to my house before they do. "Will you help me?" Within 30 minutes, we had a plan. I called Marcus, explaining the situation and requesting his presence at the house as a legal witness. Then I contacted a locksmith I trusted, the same one my father had used for years, and arranged for him to meet us there. I can't come with you, Mia said. If Rebecca discovers I warned you. I understand, I assured her. You've done enough already, but please, be careful. They'll be looking for the leak. I've already accepted a job at Memorial Hospital, starting next week, she replied with a small smile. My resignation letter is on Rebecca's desk, effective immediately. As Mia left, I gathered my essentials and headed to the home I had shared with Daniel, the place I had once believed was the foundation of our life together. Now it felt like just another battlefield in this expanding war. The locksmith arrived just as I pulled into the driveway. Marcus was already waiting, his presence lending an official weight to what might otherwise look like a domestic dispute. You're sure about this? Marcus asked as the locksmith began working on the front door. Changing the locks is a significant escalation. They're planning to tamper with evidence, I replied. And legally, I have every right to secure my home. Within minutes, the locks were changed. I paid the locksmith generously for his after-hours service, and Marcus and I entered the house. It felt strange to be there again after nearly a month. Away. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. The framed photos of Daniel and me on vacation in Bali, the expensive art pieces we had selected together, the wedding china displayed in the dining room cabinet. Yet it all seemed like artifacts from someone else's life now. A museum of a marriage built on increasingly shaky foundations. Let's be efficient, Marcus advised. Gather anything that might be relevant to the investigation, plus any personal items you can't replace. I headed straight to my home office while Marcus documented the condition of the house on his phone, creating a record that nothing had been disturbed during our visit. My office had always been my sanctuary, the one space Daniel rarely entered. Here, surrounded by my finance textbooks and family photos, I had maintained some connection to my professional identity, even as it faded in other aspects of my life. The hidden compartment in my desk, a feature my father had insisted on when he gave me the antique piece as a graduation gift, contained exactly what I needed. Backup copies of my performance reviews from Meridian, showing consistent excellence. In financial analysis, notes from the projects where I had identified accounting irregularities, and most importantly, my original resignation letter, which clearly stated I was leaving to support Daniel's career advancement, not due to performance issues. I was gathering these documents when headlights swept across the windows. A car had pulled into the driveway. "Someone's here," Marcus called from the hallway. "Likely Daniel." My heart raced despite my resolve to remain calm. This confrontation was inevitable, but I hadn't expected it quite so soon. I quickly photographed the remaining documents with my phone and placed the originals in my bag. The sound of a key in the lock, followed by confusion and then pounding on the door, confirmed Marcus's prediction. Daniel had arrived, and he was not happy to find himself locked out of his own home. "Emma!" His voice carried clearly through the door. "I know you're in there. Open the door immediately." Marcus gestured for me to stay back while he approached the entrance. "Mr. Thompson," he called through the door. "This is Marcus Chen, attorney for Emma Wilson. She is exercising her legal right to secure her residence and personal belongings." There was a moment of silence, then, "You changed the locks? That's my house too. And you were planning to break into my personal files," I responded, moving to stand beside Marcus. "We have evidence of your conspiracy with Rebecca to tamper with my records." Another silence, longer this time. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had shifted from outrage to calculation. "Emma, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. Rebecca is prepared to offer a very generous settlement if you drop this vendetta. 7 figures, no questions asked. You could start over anywhere you want." The offer was meant to tempt me, to make me question whether this fight was worth it. 6 weeks ago, before I overheard that conversation at our dinner party, before my father's death, before I rediscovered my own strength, I might have hesitated. This isn't a vendetta, Daniel. It's about preventing patients from being harmed. by a system built on lies. No amount of money changes that. You always were stubborn, he said, his tone hardening. Fine. You've made your choice. But remember, I tried to be reasonable when this gets ugly. His footsteps retreated, followed by the sound of his car starting and driving away. That was illuminating, Marcus observed. He didn't deny the plan. To tamper with your records. And he delivered a clear threat, I added. They're going to escalate. We finished gathering my essential documents and personal items. Family photographs, jewelry inherited from my mother, and my father's favorite books that I had brought to the house after his death. As we prepared to leave, I paused in the foyer, looking at the life Daniel and I had built together. You don't have to leave everything behind, Marcus said gently. We can arrange for movers once things settle down. I shook my head. The furniture, the art, the collections, none of it matters. What I need, I'm taking now. As we drove away, I felt not loss, but a surprising lightness. I was leaving behind the trappings of a life that had slowly become a gilded cage, taking, with me, only what truly mattered: my integrity, my purpose, and the tools to fight for justice. The next morning, Sophia called with news that confirmed my fears about escalation. Meridian's PR team is briefing selected journalists about Emma Thompson's history of financial mismanagement at the company. They're claiming you were quietly dismissed for incompetence but given a face-saving story about supporting your husband's career. Exactly as they planned, I said. Are the journalists buying it? Some are asking questions. Your reputation as a financial analyst was pretty solid, but they're being heavily courted. Exclusive interviews with Rebecca, promises of inside access to Meridian's revolutionary healthcare innovations. We need to get ahead of this, I decided. It's time for me to go on record. The decision wasn't made lightly. Once I publicly identified myself as the whistleblower, there would be no turning back. Daniel and Rebecca would unleash their full arsenal against me, personally, professionally, legally. But staying silent while they rewrote my history was unacceptable. Marcus arranged a meeting with Kevin Reynolds, the lead SEC investigator handling the Meridian case. We met in the Federal Building downtown, the formal setting a reminder of the serious nature of what we were undertaking. Kevin was younger than I expected, perhaps early 40s, with the focused intensity of someone who had built his career on methodically dismantling financial schemes. Ms. Wilson, he greeted me, your documentation has been extremely helpful to our investigation. Dr. Clark's testimony corroborates many of your key points. I understand Meridian has begun a campaign to discredit me, I said, claiming I was fired for incompetence. Kevin's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. We're aware of those claims. They're inconsistent with the personnel records we've subpoenaed. Your performance reviews at Meridian were exemplary. This was a relief, but not a surprise. I had always been meticulous in my work, and despite Daniel and Rebecca's revisionist history, that fact would be documented in multiple places beyond their reach. I want to make a formal statement, I told him, on the record, as the whistleblower, in this case. Kevin considered this carefully. That's your right, of course, but you should understand that once you go public, Meridian will intensify their efforts against you. They have resources, connections, and a strong motivation to destroy your credibility. I'm aware of the risks, I replied, but they're already attacking my professional reputation. I need to counter their narrative before it becomes accepted as truth. After meeting with Kevin, I called Sophia and offered her an exclusive interview, the first public statement from the whistleblower behind the Meridian investigation. We arranged to meet that afternoon at the Observer's offices, where security could ensure no one from Meridian interrupted us. The newspaper's headquarters was a modest building downtown, its slightly worn interior speaking to the challenges of local journalism in the digital age. Sophia led me to a small conference room where a photographer was setting up. Are you sure about the photo? Sophia asked. We could describe you without identifying you visually. I'm done hiding, I replied. If I'm going to stand by my accusations, I need to do it openly. The interview lasted 3 hours. I walked Sophia through my discovery of the fraud, explaining the technical details in terms her readers would understand, how Meridian had excluded negative outcomes from their efficacy data, how they had overstated error reduction rates, how they had misrepresented the system's capabilities to secure contracts worth billions. And your husband's role in this? Sophia asked, approaching the personal aspect carefully. Daniel Thompson is Meridian's VP of Strategic Development. He was aware of the data manipulation and actively participated in concealing it, including from me. The words hurt to say aloud, but they were true. When I began asking questions, he worked with CEO Rebecca Thompson to distract me and later to intimidate me into silence. When we finished, the photographer took several portraits. I had dressed carefully for these images. A simple blue blazer over a white blouse, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back neatly. Professional, serious, credible. The woman in these photos was Emma Wilson, financial analyst and whistleblower, not Emma Thompson, corporate wife. The article will run tomorrow, Sophia said as we concluded. Front page. Are you prepared for the response? As prepared as I can be, I replied. Meridian will deny everything, attack my character, and probably file a lawsuit claiming defamation. And Daniel? I had considered this question repeatedly over the past weeks. He'll stand with Rebecca. His career, his reputation, his financial future, they're all tied to Meridian now. He made his choice when he decided to help cover up fraud rather than address it. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I experienced my first real moment of doubt. Tomorrow, my face would be on the front page of The Observer, my accusations against Meridian and my own husband made public for everyone to see. Our friends, our neighbors, Daniel's family, all would read about the collapse of our marriage alongside allegations of corporate fraud. The personal cost of this decision suddenly felt overwhelming. I called the one person who would understand without judgment, my father's oldest friend, Judge Michael Porter. I'm afraid, Michael, I admitted when he answered. Not of Meridian, or their lawyers, but of being so publicly exposed, of having my marriage dissected in the press, of being seen as either a victim or a villain, when I'm neither. Michael was silent for a moment before responding. Your father faced a similar moment early in his career. A major bank had hired him to review their accounting practices, but when he found evidence of money laundering, they pressured him to bury it. Coming forward meant losing clients, facing legal threats, being ostracized by former colleagues. What did he do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He followed the numbers and told the truth. It was difficult, professionally and personally. But years later, he told me it was the moment that defined the rest of his life. Not because of what others thought of him, but because of what he learned about himself. I thought about my father's unwavering integrity, how he had built a career and a reputation on telling difficult truths. I wish he were here now. He is, Emma. In every decision you make with integrity, he's there. After we hung up, I stood at the window of my hotel room, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the lake. Tomorrow would change everything, exposing me to public scrutiny and corporate retaliation. Yet despite my fear, I felt strangely peaceful. The truth was a powerful ally, and for the first time in years, I was fully aligned with it. Whatever came next, I would face it as Emma Wilson, my father's daughter, a woman of integrity, standing firmly in her own truth. The morning the Observer hit newsstands, I woke before dawn, my sleep disturbed by anxiety dreams I couldn't quite remember. I showered and dressed methodically, selecting a navy pantsuit that had always given me confidence during my analyst days. Today would be the first public battle in what promised to be a prolonged war. My phone vibrated with a text from Sophia. Article online now. Print edition hitting stands in 30 minutes. You okay? I wasn't sure how to answer that question. Proceeding as planned, I finally replied. It was the truth, if not the whole truth. The headline was more dramatic than I had expected. Whistleblower exposes deadly fraud at Meridian Health. They falsified patient safety data for profit. Beneath it was a photo of me looking directly into the camera, expression serious, but composed. The woman in that image projected strength I wasn't entirely sure I felt. Marcus called moments after the article went live. Stay in your hotel room today, he advised. Meridian's legal team will try to serve you with papers immediately. Likely, a defamation suit and possibly a temporary restraining order to prevent further public statements. Can they do that? Everything I said is documented. They can try, Marcus replied. It's not about winning. It's about intimidation and resource depletion. They're hoping you'll run out of money or resolve before this reaches conclusion. They don't know me very well, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. By 9 a.m., Meridian had issued their official response, a carefully crafted statement expressing disappointment that a former employee's personal grievances have escalated to baseless accusations against a company dedicated to improving patient outcomes. They claimed my allegations reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of clinical data interpretation and suggested that marital difficulties have unfortunately clouded Ms. Wilson's judgment. The statement was exactly what we had anticipated: dismissive, condescending, and attempting to frame the issue as a domestic dispute rather than corporate fraud. It also strategically avoided addressing any specific accusations, making no mention of the altered trial results or the 46% versus 12% efficacy discrepancy. Daniel wasn't quoted directly, but the statement noted that executive leadership stands united against these false claims. I wondered how he felt, seeing our marriage reduced to a PR talking point. The answer came around noon, when my phone displayed his number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Was it worth it? Daniel asked without preamble, his voice tightly controlled. Humiliating yourself? Destroying our marriage? Undermining a company that's trying to improve healthcare? Is that really how you see this? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Not as exposing dangerous fraud, but as some kind of personal vendetta. What I see, he replied coldly, is someone who's made a catastrophic error in judgment. The board is meeting now to determine next steps. Rebecca is pushing for immediate legal action against both you and the Observer. I expected nothing less. This isn't a game, Emma. You've placed yourself against a company with a $180 million legal defense fund and connections throughout the industry. And you've aligned yourself with people who falsified patient safety data for profit. I countered. Which of us should have trouble sleeping at night? His silence told me the barb had landed. It's not too late, he finally said, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. Issue a clarification. Say you were misquoted, that your concerns were overstated. We can still contain this. The we struck me. Daniel still instinctively included me in Meridian's camp, as if our marriage automatically aligned our interests with the company's. It was a telling insight into how he had viewed our relationship all along. I can't do that, Daniel. The evidence is clear, and more is emerging every day. Dr. Clark has already corroborated my claims to the SEC. Mia Johnson has resigned. This isn't going away with a press release. Then neither is what comes next, he said, the brief vulnerability gone. Meridian will use every resource to fight this. You should prepare yourself. After he hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the conversation. Despite everything, a part of me had hoped Daniel might finally recognize the ethical breach, might stand up to Rebecca and acknowledge the fraud. That hope was now conclusively dead. Whatever came next, I would face it alone. Or not entirely. Alone, I realized, as my phone began lighting up with messages from unexpected sources. Former colleagues from Appleton Financial expressing support. 2 former Meridian employees offering additional information about data manipulation. A patient safety advocate requesting an interview. And most surprisingly, a brief text from Nathan Brooks, my former supervisor at Meridian. "You always had integrity. Let me know if you need anything." These messages reminded me that while corporate power often seemed monolithic, organizations were ultimately collections of individuals, many of whom recognized right from wrong, even when incentivized to look the other way. By mid-afternoon, the story had been picked up by national outlets. Meridian's stock had dropped 17% as investors responded to the allegations and the news that the SEC was actively investigating. The company had filed a defamation lawsuit against me, as expected, demanding $15 million in damages for false claims resulting in material harm to shareholder value. "It's theatrical," Marcus assured me when he arrived at the hotel to discuss the lawsuit. "They know they can't actually recover damages from you, but filing the suit lets them tell shareholders they're aggressively addressing the situation. And gives them discovery powers to dig through my life," I added. "Exactly. They'll depose everyone who's ever known you, looking for anything to discredit your character or competence." "Let them try," I said with more confidence than I felt. "My work record speaks for itself." The real battle began the next day, when Meridian's PR team launched what could only be described as a character assassination campaign. Suddenly, various financial blogs were running stories questioning my professional capabilities, citing anonymous former colleagues who claimed I had struggled with complex analysis and often misinterpreted data. More personal attacks appeared on social media, with rumors about everything from my mental health to fabricated affairs. Daniel had not initiated these smears. I knew him well enough to be certain of that, but he did nothing to stop them either. Sophia was monitoring the situation closely. "This is standard operating procedure for corporations under scrutiny," she told me over coffee at a small bookstore cafe where we were unlikely to be recognized. "They can't effectively dispute the facts, so they attack the messenger." "It's still affecting me more than I expected," I admitted. "Seeing my professional reputation dismantled in public, having strangers discuss my marriage and mental state as if they know me." "That's exactly what they want," Sophia said, "to make this so personally painful that you back down." She was right, of course. This was tactical, designed to exhaust and demoralize me. I needed to focus on the facts, not the personal attacks. An unexpected ally emerged that afternoon when Olivia Grant, the Meridian board member who had privately expressed concerns to Marcus, publicly announced she was taking a leave of absence from the board pending resolution of serious questions about data integrity. While her statement didn't directly support my allegations, her timing sent a clear message to industry insiders. Rebecca Thompson responded with a hastily called press conference, flanked by the remaining board members and senior executives, including Daniel. She dismissed Olivia's departure as related to personal health matters and reiterated Meridian's commitment to the highest standards of scientific integrity. Watching the press conference from my hotel room, I focused on Daniel standing slightly behind Rebecca, his expression carefully neutral. Only someone who knew him intimately would recognize the tension around his eyes, the slight clench of his jaw that signaled discomfort. He was reciting the corporate script, but part of him, the part I had once loved, was struggling with the deception. The most significant development came 3 days after the Observer article, when Kevin Reynolds called to inform me that the SEC had expanded their investigation based on new information. "Several Meridian employees have come forward since your interview went public," he explained. "Engineers, data analysts, even a member of the regulatory compliance team. They're providing documentation that substantiates your claims and expands the scope considerably. In what way? I asked. It appears the data manipulation wasn't limited to the healthcare management system. We're seeing evidence of similar patterns across multiple Meridian products over a 5-year period. This was bigger than even I had suspected. What I had uncovered might be just the tip of a much larger iceberg of corporate fraud. What does this mean for the investigation timeline? I asked. We're accelerating, Kevin replied. Requesting additional documentation from Meridian and scheduling depositions with key executives next week, including your husband. The formal separation of my identity from Daniel's still felt strange, even after everything that had happened. My whistleblower status and his executive position had placed us on opposite sides of a widening chasm, yet legally, we remained married. The thought of him being deposed, potentially facing serious consequences for his role in the fraud, created a complex emotional response I wasn't entirely prepared for. That evening, as I worked with Marcus to prepare for my own upcoming SEC testimony, a knock at my hotel room door startled me. The front desk had strict instructions not to reveal my room number to anyone. "Ms. Wilson?" called an unfamiliar female voice. "I'm Audrey Parker from Memorial Hospital. I have information about Meridian's system implementation at our facility. Please, it's urgent." I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole to see a woman in her 40s wearing hospital scrubs under a light jacket. She looked anxious, but not threatening. "How did you find me?" I asked through the door. "Mia Johnson told me which hotel. Please, I've risked my job coming here." I opened the door carefully, keeping the security chain engaged. "What kind of information do you have?" "Documentation of adverse events that occurred during Meridian's pilot implementation at Memorial," she said, her voice lowered. "Events that were systematically excluded from the official reports. This could be crucial evidence or an elaborate setup by Meridian to discredit me further. I couldn't risk meeting with an unknown person alone, especially one claiming to have damaging information about Meridian. "I appreciate you coming, but I need to handle this properly," I told her. "My attorney should be present for any discussion of evidence. Can you meet us tomorrow at his office?" Relief washed over her face. "Yes, of course. I should have thought of that. After reading your interview, I couldn't stay silent anymore." We arranged a meeting for the following morning, and I immediately called Marcus to verify Audrey's identity and position before proceeding. The next day, in the safety of Marcus's office, Audrey revealed herself to be the patient safety director at Memorial Hospital, one of 3 facilities that had piloted Meridian's healthcare management system before its broader rollout. "We experienced a 23% increase in medication errors during the first month of implementation," she explained, sliding a flash drive across the table. "The system simply didn't perform as promised. When we reported this to Meridian, Rebecca Thompson personally intervened, insisting that the errors reflected implementation challenges rather than system deficiencies." "And you documented these incidents?" Marcus asked. "Meticulously," Audrey confirmed. "But when the official report was published, all negative outcomes had disappeared. Our hospital was cited as a success story, claiming a 38% reduction in errors that simply never happened." "Why come forward now?" I asked. "This implementation was over a year ago." Audrey's expression hardened. "Because Meridian is about to roll out this system to 17 more hospitals in our network, potentially putting thousands of patients at risk." Your article finally gave me hope that someone would listen. The flash drive contained exactly what Audrey had described: detailed documentation of adverse events during the pilot, alongside Meridian's drastically different official reports. Most damning was an email chain showing Rebecca explicitly directing her team to reframe Memorial's experience to support the predetermined narrative of success. "This is exactly what we need," Marcus said after reviewing the documents. contemporary evidence of deliberate falsification with clear patient safety implications. We arranged for Audrey to speak directly with Kevin Reynolds at the SEC, adding her evidence to the growing case against Meridian. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's not easy standing up to an organization like Meridian. What you're doing matters." Her words stayed with me throughout the day, a reminder of the real stakes, beyond stock prices and legal maneuvering. This wasn't just about corporate fraud or my personal vindication. It was about preventing harm to real patients who would rely on Meridian's flawed systems. The tempo of events accelerated rapidly after Audrey's revelations. The SEC issued subpoenas to Rebecca, Daniel, and 3 other Meridian executives. Memorial Hospital announced it was suspending implementation of Meridian's system pending further review. 2 more hospitals followed suit within days. Meridian's stock fell another 22%, triggering an emergency board meeting. Through careful sources, Sophia learned that the board was splitting into factions, those standing firmly with Rebecca versus those questioning whether a leadership change might be necessary to salvage the company's reputation and value. "Daniel," called again, his voice strained. "The board is in panic mode. Half of them want Rebecca's resignation. The other half are afraid it would look like an admission of guilt." "It would be," I pointed out, "because Meridian is guilty of exactly what I've alleged." "It's more complicated than that," he insisted. "The system does work when properly implemented. The trials weren't entirely falsified, just optimized." "Optimized?" I repeated incredulously. "Daniel, they reported a 46% reduction in medication errors when the actual number was 12%. They excluded adverse events that contradicted their marketing claims. They pressured hospitals to misrepresent their experiences. That's not optimization. It's fraud." His silence told me he couldn't effectively counter these points. "Emma," he finally said, his voice softer now, "I'm being deposed tomorrow. The SEC has emails where I discussed the data adjustments with Rebecca. This could become a criminal matter." The implications hung between us. Daniel wasn't just facing professional embarrassment or civil penalties. He could potentially face criminal charges for fraud, depending on his level of involvement and what the investigation uncovered. "You need your own attorney," I advised, surprised to find I still cared what happened to him despite everything. "Someone not connected to Meridian or Rebecca. Someone who will prioritize your interests, not the company's." "Why would you tell me that?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "After what I've done? After standing with Meridian against you?" I considered the question carefully. "Because despite everything, I don't want to see you sacrifice yourself to protect Rebecca's fraud. You made poor choices, Daniel, but you don't deserve to be her scapegoat." The day of my formal testimony to the SEC arrived with a sense of culmination. After weeks of gathering evidence, building support, and weathering Meridian's attacks, I would finally present my complete case to the regulatory body with the power to impose real consequences. The federal building's conference room was impersonal, but impressive, with its long table and official seals displayed on the wall. Kevin Reynolds and 2 other investigators were present, along with a court reporter to record every word. Marcus sat beside me, a reassuring presence as I prepared to revisit the entire painful history. For nearly 4 hours, I methodically walked through my discovery of the fraud, the specific instances of data manipulation, the documents and testimonies that supported my allegations, and the attempts to silence or discredit me. The investigators asked detailed questions, particularly about conversations I had overheard between Rebecca and various executives. "And did your husband, Daniel Thompson, explicitly acknowledge awareness of the data manipulation in your presence?" Kevin asked. This was the moment I had dreaded, the point where my testimony might directly implicate Daniel in criminal wrongdoing. I could legally refuse to testify against my spouse, but doing so would undermine the credibility of my entire account. Yes, I answered truthfully. On at least 3 occasions, he and Rebecca discussed the adjustment of trial results to meet investor expectations. In one specific instance, following my questions about discrepancies I had noticed, Daniel assured Rebecca that I would not pursue the matter further. The words felt like a betrayal, despite being accurate. I had not married Daniel expecting to one day testify against him in a federal investigation. Yet here we were, our life together reduced to evidence in a fraud case. As the testimony concluded, Kevin informed me that the SEC was now coordinating with the Department of Justice, given the serious nature of the fraud and its potential impact on patient safety. What had begun as a regulatory investigation was evolving into a potential criminal case. Outside the federal building, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza. Marcus had gone ahead to bring his car around, leaving me momentarily alone with my thoughts. The weight of the day's testimony, the finality of placing everything on official record, left me feeling both lighter and somehow more vulnerable. Emma. I turned to find Daniel standing several yards away, looking more disheveled than I had ever seen him. His usually immaculate suit was creased, his tie loosened, dark circles prominent under his eyes. "What are you doing here?" I asked, glancing around for Marcus. "My deposition was this morning," he replied. "I've been waiting, hoping to see you." I maintained my distance, wary of his presence after everything that had transpired. "I don't think we should be talking without our attorneys present." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of stress I remembered from our early days together, when he was still building his career. "I just needed to tell you something directly, not through lawyers or press statements." Despite my better judgment, I found myself curious. "What is it?" "You were right," he said simply. "About all of it. The data manipulation, the pressure. On hospitals, Rebecca's deliberate concealment of adverse events. I knew it was happening, and I rationalized it because it served my ambitions." The admission was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't respond. "I told the SEC everything today," he continued. "Every meeting, every directive, every instance where I knew the numbers were being misrepresented. I've agreed to cooperate fully with their investigation, including testifying against Rebecca if necessary." "Why?" I finally managed. "Why now, after fighting so hard to protect Meridian?" Daniel looked away, gazing across the plaza before meeting my eyes again. "Because when I heard you were testifying today, I realized I couldn't let you stand alone with the truth while I continued living a lie." He paused. "And because your father deserved better from the man who married his daughter." The mention of my father, his implicit understanding of what had driven my actions from the beginning, caught me off guard. For just a moment, I glimpsed the man I had fallen in love with years ago, before ambition and compromise had eroded his principles. "What happens now?" I asked. "Legally? I've negotiated limited immunity in exchange for my cooperation. Professionally? My career at Meridian is over, obviously. The board has placed me on administrative leave pending a formal separation agreement." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Personally, that depends partly on you." "On me?" "I don't expect forgiveness, Emma, or reconciliation. Too much has happened. But I hoped. Maybe once this is all over, we could talk. Really talk. About what went wrong between us, long before Meridian's fraud entered the picture." Marcus's car appeared at the curb, breaking the moment. "I need to go," I said, uncertain how to respond to Daniel's unexpected vulnerability. He nodded, stepping back. "I understand. Just think about it." As I walked away, I realized I was trembling slightly. Daniel's confession and apparent transformation were complications I hadn't anticipated. The neat narrative of corporate villain versus righteous whistleblower had suddenly acquired shades of gray that would require careful consideration. But That was for another day. Today, I had done what my father would have expected. I had followed the numbers and told the truth, regardless of personal cost. Whatever came next, for Meridian, for Daniel, for my own future, would build upon that foundation of integrity. In the car, Marcus noticed my distracted expression. Everything all right? I looked back at the Federal Building, where Daniel still stood watching our departure. Not yet, I replied honestly. But I think it might be, eventually. The week following my SEC testimony unfolded with dizzying speed. Meridian's carefully constructed defense began to crumble as more employees came forward with corroborating evidence. 3 additional hospitals suspended implementation of the healthcare management system, citing unresolved safety concerns. The company's stock fell below its initial public offering price for the first time in 5 years. Most significantly, Daniel's cooperation with investigators changed the entire dynamic of the case. As Vice President of Strategic Development, he had been present for key decisions and had access to documents and conversations that might otherwise have remained hidden. His testimony provided a roadmap for investigators, pointing them towards specific meetings, email chains, and financial records that revealed the full extent of the fraud. Your husband's cooperation has accelerated our timeline considerably, Kevin Reynolds told me during a brief phone call. The evidence suggests this wasn't isolated to the healthcare management system, but extended to at least 3 other Meridian products over a 7-year period. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since our unexpected encounter outside the Federal Building. His revelation had left me conflicted, grateful for his decision to support the truth, yet wary of attributing too much nobility to what might simply be a strategic legal maneuver to save himself. Years of marriage had taught me that Daniel's self-interest often masqueraded as principle when circumstances demanded. Sophia brought additional insights gleaned from her sources at Meridian. The board is in complete disarray, she reported. During one of our regular meetings at the Botanical Gardens Cafe, half want to fire Rebecca immediately and negotiate a settlement with regulators. The other half, mostly her longtime allies, insist that settling would destroy shareholder value and that they should fight to the end. And where does that leave the patients potentially harmed by their products? I asked. Sophia's expression darkened. That question doesn't seem to factor prominently in their discussions, based on what I'm hearing. This callous disregard for patient welfare reinforced my conviction that exposing Meridian had been necessary, regardless of the personal cost. Real lives hung in the balance, not just abstract concepts of corporate ethics or regulatory compliance. My temporary residence at the hotel had begun to feel increasingly inadequate as the case expanded. With Marcus's help, I found a small apartment overlooking the lake, signing a 6-month lease that acknowledged the uncertain nature of my future. Moving my limited possessions from the hotel took less than an hour. A stark reminder of how much I had left behind at the house I once shared with Daniel. As I arranged my father's books on the apartment's built-in shelves, my phone rang, with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, wary of journalists who had somehow obtained my contact information, but something prompted me to answer. Ms. Wilson, this is Dr. Eleanor Hughes from Westside Medical Center. I understand you're the whistleblower in the Meridian case. My guard immediately went up. Yes, that's correct. How can I help you? I'm calling because we've experienced concerning incidents with Meridian system at our hospital. We implemented it 4 months ago, and we've documented a statistically significant increase in medication errors, despite Meridian's claims to the contrary. This was exactly the scenario I had feared. A hospital already using the flawed system and potentially experiencing adverse events. Have patients been harmed? I asked, the question that mattered most. Dr. Hughes hesitated. We've had 3 serious medication errors that required intervention. All patients recovered, but the pattern is troubling. When we raised concerns with Meridian, they insisted it was an implementation issue, not a system flaw. The classic deflection, I noted. They use the same approach with Memorial Hospital. Exactly. I've spoken with Audrey Parker at Memorial, which is how I got your number. We're considering suspending use of the system, but administration is concerned about potential liability and the lack of an immediate alternative. You should know that the FDA has been notified about the safety concerns, I told her. They're conducting their own review parallel to the SEC investigation. It might be worth contacting them directly with your data. That's exactly why I'm calling. We need guidance on how to proceed, both to protect our patients and to ensure our documentation supports the broader investigation. By the end of the conversation, I had connected Dr. Hughes with Kevin Reynolds and Marcus Chen, establishing another formal channel for evidence collection. It was the third such call I had received from healthcare professionals in 2 weeks, a growing network of concerned clinicians who had witnessed firsthand the disconnect between Meridian's promises and the system's actual performance. That evening, as I was preparing a simple dinner in my new kitchen, there was a knock at my door. I approached cautiously, checking the peephole to find Olivia Grant, the Meridian board member who had taken a leave of absence after my allegations became public. I opened the door but maintained a defensive posture. Ms. Grant, this is unexpected. I apologize for arriving unannounced, she said, her normally polished appearance slightly disheveled. But I needed to speak with you directly, away from Meridian's surveillance. I hesitated, then gestured for her to enter. How did you find my address? Daniel provided it, she admitted. He thought you would want to hear what I have to say. The mention of Daniel's involvement did nothing to ease my suspicion. And what is that, exactly? Olivia placed her designer handbag on the counter and extracted a thin folder. The board held an emergency meeting today. Rebecca presented what she called a resolution strategy, essentially a plan to contain the damage by offering a moderate settlement to regulators while publicly maintaining the efficacy of the system. That's hardly surprising, I noted. They've been denying the problems from the beginning. What you don't know is that Rebecca presented internal testing data, showing she was aware of the system's flaws before the first hospital implementation. Olivia slid the folder toward me. These documents prove she knowingly misrepresented the product's capabilities to the board, to investors, and to healthcare facilities. I glanced at the papers without touching them. Why bring this to me instead of the SEC? Olivia's expression hardened. Because 7 board members still support Rebecca. They're willing to sacrifice patient safety to protect their investments. I've already contacted the SEC, but these documents will likely disappear before investigators can access them through official channels. The scenario fit with everything I had learned about Meridian's corporate culture. The prioritization of profit over safety, the willingness to conceal damaging information, the calculation that financial interests outweighed ethical obligations. Why are you doing this? I asked. You have more to lose than gain by opposing Rebecca. Olivia was silent for a moment, her composure slipping to reveal genuine emotion. My sister is a nurse at Central Memorial. She would be using this system daily if they implemented it as planned. This isn't about Meridian's stock price or my board position anymore. It's about preventing harm. Her motivation rang true. I had learned to recognize authentic concern through my growing network of healthcare whistleblowers, the distinctive tone of someone whose professional detachment had given way to personal involvement. I'll ensure these reach the proper authorities, I assured her, and your role will remain confidential if that's what you prefer. It won't matter soon, she replied with a grim smile. By providing these documents, I've violated my board confidentiality agreement. Once Rebecca discovers the leak, my position will be terminated regardless of whether my name is public. After Olivia left, I immediately called Marcus and arranged to transfer the documents to him for proper submission to the SEC. The evidence she had provided was damning. Internal quality assurance reports showing error rates nearly 5 times higher than publicly claimed, coupled with emails in which Rebecca explicitly directed marketing to focus on the best-case scenarios and omit outlier data points. The most disturbing document was a cost-benefit analysis comparing the expense of addressing the system's core flaws against the projected legal costs of settling potential lawsuits from adverse events. Rebecca had approved proceeding with implementation based on the calculation that settlements would cost less than proper re-engineering of the system. "This is exactly what we needed," Marcus confirmed after reviewing the materials. "Direct evidence of knowledge and intent at the highest level. The SEC and DOJ will move much more aggressively with this in hand." The impact was immediate and decisive. The following morning, the SEC announced it was expanding its investigation and had referred evidence of potential criminal wrongdoing to the Department of Justice. Meridian's stock plummeted another 32% in a single day. 3 more board members resigned, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. Daniel called while I was reviewing news coverage of the latest developments. I hesitated before answering, still uncertain how to navigate our complex new reality. "Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "Yes. The DOJ referral changes everything. Rebecca's been placed on administrative leave pending a formal vote to terminate her position," he reported. "The remaining board members are in panic mode. There's talk of bankruptcy protection if the class action lawsuits materialize as expected." I processed this information, trying to separate my feelings about Meridian's deserved downfall from the impact on innocent employees who would suffer from the company's collapse. "What about the healthcare system?" I asked. "Is there a plan to notify facilities about the safety concerns?" Daniel sighed heavily. "That's the current battle. The legal team wants to avoid any statement that could be construed as admission of fault. The ethics and safety team is pushing for immediate disclosure to all clients. It's contentious. People could be harmed while they debate liability concerns," I pointed out, unable to keep the frustration from my voice. "I know," Daniel replied, surprising me with his straightforward acknowledgement. "That's why I went directly to the FDA yesterday with everything I have. They're issuing a safety alert to all facilities using Meridian systems, independent of the company's official position." This was not the action of the Daniel I had known at Meridian, the calculated executive who prioritized strategic advantage over ethical considerations. Perhaps his cooperation with authorities was more than legal self-preservation after all. "That was the right thing to do," I said carefully. "It's what your father would have expected," he replied quietly. After a brief hesitation, he added, "Emma, would you consider meeting me? Neutral location, just to talk. There are things I need to say to you that shouldn't happen over the phone." The request stirred conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted nothing more than complete separation from Daniel and everything associated with our former life. Another part recognized that proper closure might require one final, honest conversation. "I'll think about it," I promised. "But not right now. There's too much happening with the investigation." "I understand. The offer stands whenever you're ready." The following days brought a whirlwind of developments. The FDA issued a formal safety alert regarding Meridian's healthcare management system, recommending that facilities implement additional verification protocols until a full evaluation could be completed. 5 more hospitals suspended use of the system entirely. A coalition of patient safety organizations called for an independent review of all Meridian products currently in use in healthcare settings. Rebecca Thompson finally broke her silence with a carefully worded statement, announcing her resignation to focus on addressing the baseless allegations that have unfairly tarnished Meridian's reputation. The transparent attempt to position herself as the victim fooled few, especially after multiple news outlets published details from the internal documents Olivia had provided. Amidst this chaos, I received an unexpected invitation from Sophia Martinez. The Observer is hosting a panel discussion on corporate whistleblowing and patient safety, she explained. Healthcare leaders, ethics experts, and regulatory officials will be participating. They've asked if you would consider joining as well. My immediate instinct was to decline. Despite my central role in exposing Meridian's fraud, I had never sought the public spotlight. My goal had been justice and patient safety, not personal recognition. I'm not sure that's appropriate while the investigation is ongoing, I hedged. That's exactly why your perspective matters, Sophia countered. This isn't about the specific allegations against Meridian. It's about the broader issues of corporate accountability and the challenges whistleblowers face. Your experience puts a human face on an issue that's too often discussed in abstract terms. After consulting with Marcus, who confirmed that a carefully structured panel appearance wouldn't compromise the investigation, I reluctantly agreed. The event would be held at Lakeside University's School of Public Health, an appropriately neutral venue with the academic credibility to frame the discussion responsibly. I spent the days leading up to the panel in careful preparation, working with Marcus to define the boundaries of what I could discuss publicly. The ongoing investigations limited my ability to address specific evidence or allegations, but I could speak to the personal and professional challenges of whistleblowing, the isolation, the retaliation, the difficult ethical calculations that preceded my decision to come forward. The evening of the panel arrived with unexpected media interest. What had been planned as a moderate-sized academic discussion had expanded to fill the university's largest lecture hall, with local television stations setting up cameras in the back. Seeing the crowd as I arrived backstage sent a wave of anxiety through me. This level of public exposure hadn't been part of my carefully managed approach to the case. "You don't have to do this," Marcus reminded me as we watched from the wings. "You can still decline if it feels too overwhelming." I thought of my father, of his unwavering belief that truth required not just discovery but public defense. No, I decided. These conversations need to happen. I just didn't expect to be having them in front of television cameras. The panel composition helped ease my concerns. Besides myself, the participants included Dr. Andrew Clark, Meridian's former medical director who had resigned rather than continue supporting the company's false claims, Dr. Eleanor Hughes from Westside Medical Center, a nationally recognized expert on healthcare ethics, and a former FDA official who specialized in medical technology oversight. The moderator was a respected medical journalist with no connection to The Observer or to Meridian. When introduced, I took my seat feeling strangely calm despite the packed auditorium. My prepared notes remained folded in my pocket, unnecessary now that I had found clarity about my role in this larger narrative. The discussion began with broad questions about the tension between innovation and safety in healthcare technology. Dr. Clark spoke eloquently about the pressure on developers to demonstrate dramatic improvements to secure investment and regulatory approval. Dr. Hughes described the challenges healthcare facilities face when implementing complex new systems with limited ability to independently verify manufacturers' claims. When the moderator turned to me, her question was direct but fair. "Ms. Wilson, you made the difficult decision to publicly challenge a company where you had previously worked, a company where your husband held an executive position. What ultimately convinced you that whistleblowing was necessary despite the personal and professional costs?" The room fell silent, waiting for my response. I leaned slightly toward the microphone, conscious of choosing my words carefully. There was a moment of perfect clarity, I began. I overheard a conversation where executives explicitly acknowledged they were misrepresenting the system's safety performance, knowing that implementation based on those false claims could harm patients. In that moment, the calculation became simple. Whatever I might lose personally, relationship, reputation, financial security, couldn't outweigh the potential harm to countless patients who would never know why the systems designed to protect them had failed. "And did you consider working within the system?" the moderator asked. "Raising concerns through internal channels before going public?" That's always the first approach a potential whistleblower should consider, I acknowledged. But in this case, the deception was happening at the highest levels of the organization. The normal reporting channels led directly to the people orchestrating the fraud. External reporting became the only viable option for preventing harm. As the discussion continued, I found myself speaking with increasing confidence about the structural challenges that often silence potential whistleblowers: fear of retaliation, financial vulnerability, isolation, and the immense power imbalance between individuals and corporations. These weren't just theoretical concerns. They were the very real barriers I had personally navigated. During the audience question period, a young woman in medical scrubs stood at the microphone. "Ms. Wilson, do you regret your decision, given the personal cost you've experienced?" I considered the question seriously, acknowledging its complexity. There are moments of regret about the collateral damage, the end of my marriage, the loss of financial security, the stress of ongoing litigation. But regret about the decision itself? No. When you see harm being done and have the power to stop it, remaining silent makes you complicit. As the event concluded, several audience members approached with their own stories, healthcare professionals who had witnessed concerning practices but felt powerless to address them. Each conversation reinforced what had become increasingly clear. My experience with Meridian, while personally painful, had touched a nerve in the broader healthcare community. The case had become something larger than one company's fraud or one whistleblower's struggle. Outside the lecture hall, as Marcus helped me navigate through lingering audience members and reporters, I spotted a familiar figure standing near the exit. Daniel had attended the panel, watching from the back of the room where I wouldn't notice him during the discussion. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded foyer, and he gave a small nod before turning to leave. "Do you want to speak with him?" Marcus asked, noting the exchange. I hesitated, then shook my head. Not tonight. Tonight was about something bigger than our personal situation. The next morning brought news that dramatically altered the landscape of the case. The Department of Justice announced it was filing criminal charges against Rebecca Thompson and James Peterson, Meridian's CFO, for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The charges specifically cited knowing misrepresentation of product safety data to investors and healthcare providers, and alleged that the executives had prioritized financial performance over patient safety. More surprising was the announcement that the DOJ had reached a deferred prosecution agreement with Meridian as a corporate entity. In exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations, implementation of stringent compliance protocols, and establishment of a $380 million victim compensation fund, the company would avoid criminal indictment. The agreement explicitly required Meridian to issue safety warnings for all affected products and provide remediation or replacement at no cost to healthcare facilities. "It's the best possible outcome," Marcus explained when I called him for clarification. "Criminal charges against the individuals most responsible, but a path forward that doesn't destroy the company and leave thousands unemployed. And most importantly, real resources dedicated to addressing the safety issues and compensating affected parties." I wasn't entirely convinced. How can they be sure Meridian won't simply return to the same practices once the spotlight fades? The agreement includes 5 years of independent monitoring and reporting requirements. Any further violations would trigger immediate prosecution. He paused. Also, the new interim CEO is apparently committed to a complete cultural overhaul. "Who did they appoint?" I asked, curious about the board's choice given the circumstances. "Nathan Brooks, your former supervisor at Meridian." The news was unexpected but encouraging. Nathan had always demonstrated genuine concern for ethical considerations, even when they complicated business objectives. His appointment suggested the board was serious about meaningful reform rather than mere damage control. As I processed these developments, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, something like closure. though the case was far from completely resolved. The primary wrongdoers would face justice. The system's safety issues would be addressed. Affected patients would have access to compensation, and perhaps most importantly, the precedent had been established that falsifying healthcare safety data carried serious consequences, no matter how powerful the company involved. That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony overlooking the lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. For the first time since discovering Meridian's fraud, I allowed myself to think beyond the immediate battle to what might come next in my own life. My financial analysis skills remained sharp, perhaps even enhanced by the forensic work of the past months. Several patient safety organizations had approached me about potential consulting roles. Sophia had suggested I consider writing about my experiences once the legal matters were sufficiently resolved. All represented possible paths forward, ways to transform a painful chapter into something meaningful. My phone chimed with a text message from Daniel. "Saw you on the panel last night. You were magnificent. When you're ready to talk, I'm here." After a moment's consideration, I replied with the simple truth. "I think I'm almost ready. But I need to find myself fully before I can have that conversation with you." His response came quickly. "I understand. I'll be here when you are." Setting the phone aside, I returned my gaze to the lake, watching as the last light faded from the water. The path ahead wasn't entirely clear, but for the first time in months, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than peril. Whatever came next would be shaped by choice rather than necessity, built on the foundation of integrity that had guided me through the darkest moments. My father would have understood. He had always taught me that the hardest right choices eventually led to the most meaningful opportunities. In exposing Meridian's fraud, I had not only honored his legacy, but had discovered my own capacity for principled courage, a discovery that would shape whatever future I chose to build from here. 3 months after the Department of Justice filed criminal charges against Rebecca Thompson and James Peterson, I found myself standing in the federal courthouse, preparing to testify at Rebecca's trial. The intervening period had been filled with depositions, evidence reviews, and careful preparation with the prosecution team. Rebecca had pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining publicly that she had been unaware of any data manipulation, and that any misrepresentations had occurred at lower levels without her knowledge. This defense strategy effectively threw her subordinates, including Daniel, under the bus, suggesting they had concealed the truth from executive leadership. It was a transparent attempt to rewrite history that the prosecution was confident they could disprove through documentary evidence and witness testimony. "Remember, just focus on what you personally observed and heard," advised Melissa Patel, the lead prosecutor, as we sat in a small conference room before my scheduled testimony. "Rebecca's attorney will try to characterize your statements as speculative or biased due to your connection to Daniel. Stick to direct observations." I nodded, smoothing the lapel of my charcoal suit. I've been preparing for this moment since I first overheard Rebecca discussing the data manipulation. In some ways, this testimony feels like the culmination of everything that's happened. "Your testimony is crucial," Melissa acknowledged, "but it's just one component of the case. The documentation you helped uncover, combined with testimony from multiple Meridian employees, creates a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud that no single witness could establish alone." This perspective helped ease the pressure I felt. Throughout the investigation, I had worried that the outcome would hinge entirely on my credibility versus Rebecca's, that the case would devolve into a he said, she said situation where my motives could be easily questioned due to my complicated personal connections to Meridian. Learning that my testimony was important but not singularly decisive provided unexpected relief. As we walked toward the courtroom, I spotted Daniel sitting on a bench in the hallway, reviewing documents with his attorney. He looked up as we approached, his expression unreadable. We hadn't yet had the in-depth conversation he had requested, though we had communicated sporadically about practical matters related to the case and our still pending divorce. "Emma," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Good luck in there." "Thank you," I replied simply. The courtroom setting wasn't appropriate for anything more personal, but I appreciated the small gesture of support. It hinted at the possibility that whatever conversation we eventually had might be productive rather than contentious. The courtroom fell silent as I was called to the stand. Taking the oath, I was acutely aware of Rebecca's presence at the defense table. She watched me with the same calculating expression I remembered from countless Meridian meetings, evaluating, assessing for weaknesses, planning her counter-strategy. The familiarity of that look strengthened my resolve. This was the woman who had knowingly endangered patients for profit, who had dismissed concerns about system flaws with corporate doublespeak about acceptable margins of error. Melissa guided me through my testimony methodically, establishing my background, my role at Meridian before leaving to support Daniel's career, and the circumstances that led to my discovery of the fraud. I described the dinner party where I'd overheard Rebecca discussing the manipulation of trial results with James Peterson, quoting her exact words. "The regulatory team has been handled. Besides, by the time anyone could possibly raise questions, we'll have secured the government contracts." When asked about Rebecca's knowledge of the system's actual performance versus reported results, I referenced the specific meeting where she had directed marketing to focus on the best-case scenarios and omit outlier data points, even when those outliers represented significant safety concerns. "Was there any indication that Ms. Thompson was unaware of the discrepancy between actual and reported efficacy rates?" Melissa asked. "None whatsoever," I replied confidently. Rebecca personally reviewed all major efficacy metrics before investor presentations and regulatory submissions. She specifically instructed the team to report the 46% error reduction figure, despite knowing the actual rate was approximately 12%. Rebecca's attorney, Lawrence Bennett, was a renowned defense lawyer, with a reputation for aggressive cross-examination. As he approached the podium, I centered myself, mentally reviewing Marcus's advice about remaining calm and precise, regardless of provocative questioning. "Ms. Wilson," Bennett began, emphasizing my maiden name with subtle condescension, "you've presented yourself as a concerned whistleblower motivated solely by patient safety. Yet isn't it true that you only came forward with these allegations after your marriage to Daniel Thompson began experiencing difficulties?" "No, that's not accurate," I replied evenly. "I began gathering evidence immediately after discovering the fraud, weeks before any marital issues arose. My father's death and Daniel's reaction to my concerns about Meridian's data manipulation created the marital tension, not the other way around." Bennett shifted tactics. "You claim to have overheard my client discussing data manipulation at a dinner party you hosted. Were there any other witnesses to this alleged conversation?" The conversation occurred between Rebecca Thompson and James Peterson in a relatively private corner of the kitchen when they believed no one else was listening, I explained. However, the content of that conversation has been corroborated by internal documents and testimony from other Meridian employees. For nearly 2 hours, Bennett attempted to undermine my credibility, suggesting variously that I was motivated by revenge against Daniel, financial gain through potential whistleblower, rewards or resentment over my abandoned career. Each time, I redirected to the documented evidence that supported my testimony, refusing to be drawn into emotional responses or speculation. The most challenging moment came when Bennett displayed emails between Daniel and me from years earlier, in which I had expressed frustration about putting my career on hold. "Isn't it true, Ms. Wilson, that you resented the success Meridian achieved without your direct involvement? That you felt entitled to recognition you hadn't earned?" The question was designed to provoke an emotional response, to make me appear bitter and vindictive rather than principled. I took a deep breath before answering. My concerns about Meridian had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with patient safety, I stated firmly. When a healthcare company falsifies efficacy data, real people are harmed. My professional background simply allowed me to recognize the discrepancies that others might have missed. As my testimony concluded, Rebecca's expression had shifted from calculated confidence to thinly disguised concern. The prosecution's case was stronger than she had anticipated, built on multiple independent sources of evidence rather than relying solely on my account. Leaving the courthouse, I felt both drained and strangely liberated. After months of preparation and anticipation, having finally delivered my testimony under oath created a sense of completion, regardless of the trial's ultimate outcome. Marcus was waiting outside, having attended to observe the proceedings. "You were excellent," he said as we walked toward his car. Composed, specific, and unshakable on the key points. Bennett couldn't land a single effective blow. It still felt like being in the crosshairs for hours, I admitted. I keep thinking about what happens if the jury doesn't convict. The criminal case has a higher burden of proof than the regulatory actions and civil lawsuits, Marcus reminded me. Even if the criminal charges don't result in conviction, which I think is unlikely given the evidence, the SEC penalties and shareholder lawsuits will ensure significant consequences. As we drove away from the courthouse, I noticed Nathan Brooks, Meridian's interim CEO, giving a statement to reporters gathered on the steps. From the car window, I could see his serious expression as he addressed the cameras. Meridian Health Solutions remains committed to cooperating fully with all investigations and to implementing the comprehensive compliance and safety protocols outlined in our agreement with the Department of Justice. The actions under scrutiny in this trial do not reflect the values of the company moving forward. It was a carefully worded statement that acknowledged wrongdoing without explicitly admitting liability. Exactly what you would expect from a company in Meridian's position. Yet coming from Nathan, who had privately expressed support for my whistleblowing actions, the words carried additional weight. Perhaps real change at Meridian was possible, though it would require vigilance and continued external pressure. The following days brought an unexpected development. Dr. Eleanor Hughes from Westside Medical Center contacted me about a coalition of healthcare facilities that had used Meridian's system. "We're establishing an independent oversight committee to evaluate the remediation efforts," she explained. "Given your unique perspective and financial background, we'd like you to consider joining as an advisor." The invitation represented a potential new chapter, an opportunity to transform my whistleblowing experience into constructive institutional reform. Rather than simply exposing problems, I could help develop solutions that would prevent similar situations in the future. I'd need to consult with the prosecution team to ensure there's no conflict of interest while the trial is ongoing, I cautioned. "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "But the prosecutor's office has actually expressed support for the initiative. They see independent oversight as complementary to the legal remedies they're pursuing." After confirming with Melissa that my participation wouldn't compromise the case, I agreed to join the committee on a preliminary basis. The work would involve reviewing Meridian's remediation plans, establishing metrics to evaluate their effectiveness, and creating transparent reporting mechanisms to ensure ongoing compliance. My first committee meeting coincided with a major announcement in Rebecca's trial. James Peterson, Meridian's former CFO, had accepted a plea deal and agreed to testify against Rebecca. His cooperation virtually guaranteed her conviction on at least some of the charges, dramatically altering the calculus of her defense strategy. The news created a stir among committee members, many of whom were still dealing with the practical and financial implications of having implemented Meridian's flawed system. "What does this mean for the remediation efforts?" asked the chief medical officer of a large hospital network. "If Peterson is confirming systematic fraud, does that invalidate the entire technical approach Meridian used?" "Not necessarily," I explained. drawing on my knowledge of both the technical issues and the corporate decision-making that had compromised them. The core technology had merit, which is why it performed well in controlled settings. The problems arose when marketing pressures led to premature release and misrepresentation of capabilities. A proper engineering review can identify and address the specific flaws without discarding the foundational approach. This perspective, separating the legitimate innovation from the corporate malfeasance that had corrupted it, resonated with the committee. Many members were healthcare professionals who had initially been excited about the system's potential to improve patient care, only to become disillusioned when the reality failed to match the promises. As the committee work proceeded, I found myself in a position I hadn't anticipated, using my financial expertise and insider knowledge of Meridian to help rehabilitation efforts rather than simply contributing to the company's punishment. It was a constructive role that aligned with my original motivation, protecting patients from harm. The parallel track of Rebecca's trial continued, with Daniel scheduled to testify the following week. His cooperation agreement with prosecutors meant his testimony would directly implicate Rebecca in knowledge of the fraud, contradicting her claims of ignorance about the data manipulation. This testimony would place him in direct opposition to the woman who had been his mentor and champion throughout his Meridian career, a position I understood must be enormously difficult despite everything that had happened. The evening before his scheduled court appearance, Daniel called. "Would you be willing to meet for coffee?" he asked, his voice betraying uncharacteristic uncertainty. I could use someone to talk to who understands both sides of this situation. I hesitated, weighing whether this was the right time for the personal conversation we had been postponing. "Is this about your testimony?" "Partly," he admitted, "but also about everything else. I'm finally ready to really talk about what happened between us, before Meridian, during Meridian, and where we go from here." After careful consideration, I agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near my apartment. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee waiting. He looked simultaneously familiar and strange, the husband I had known for years, yet somehow altered by everything that had transpired. "Thank you for coming," he said as I took the seat across from him. "I know you don't owe me this." "We both deserve closure," I replied honestly. "Whatever form that takes." Daniel nodded, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I've been thinking constantly about how we got here, not just the fraud case, but the breakdown of our marriage. I've realized it started long before Meridian's data manipulation. It began when I started valuing external validation over integrity, when I began seeing you as an accessory to my career rather than a partner with your own ambitions and insights." The frank self-assessment surprised me. Daniel had always been skilled at justifying his choices, at constructing narratives that placed him in the most favorable light. This unflinching acknowledgement of his fundamental errors represented a significant shift. "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious. "When did you start to see things differently?" He considered the question carefully. "It wasn't one moment. It was an accumulation, watching you stand firm despite Meridian's attacks, seeing how others responded to your courage, realizing that my success was built on compromises that left me unable to face myself." He paused. "And honestly, your father's death affected me too. He was always the voice of authentic integrity in our lives, the person who never confused status with character. Losing that influence highlighted how far I'd strayed from the values I once claimed to hold." I sipped my coffee, absorbing his words. "I appreciate the self-reflection, Daniel, truly. But understanding what went wrong doesn't automatically create a path forward." "I know," he acknowledged. "I'm not asking for reconciliation. That would be presumptuous, given everything that's happened. I just want you to know that I recognize my responsibility for the breakdown of our marriage long before the whistleblowing situation forced us to opposite sides." "And tomorrow's testimony?" I asked, returning to his initial reason for wanting to meet. "Are you prepared to directly implicate Rebecca?" Daniel's expression tightened. "It's difficult. She mentored me, championed my advancement, brought me into her inner circle. But she also deliberately endangered patients for profit and tried to make me complicit in that decision. The truth is, she crossed lines I should never have allowed myself to approach, let alone cross." "Your testimony will make her conviction almost certain," I noted. "Her attorney will try to paint you as shifting blame to save yourself." "I know, but I have the documentation to back up every statement. Emails, meeting notes, calendar entries that prove she was directly involved in the data manipulation. The immunity agreement means I have no personal incentive to lie about her role." He met my gaze directly. "I'm finally choosing truth over loyalty to the wrong people." We talked for nearly 2 hours, moving beyond the immediate concerns of the trial to more personal territory. The gradual erosion of trust in our marriage, the moments when we might have chosen different paths, the values we had each compromised or maintained through difficult circumstances. The conversation wasn't about reconciliation, but understanding, mapping the journey that had brought us to this point of irrevocable change. There was sadness in this recognition, but also clarity. Whatever paths we took moving forward would be chosen with clearer vision and stronger boundaries. As we prepared to leave, Daniel asked the question that had likely motivated his request to meet. "After the trial ends and the divorce is finalized, do you think we could find a way to be something other than adversaries? Not partners again, but perhaps eventually friends?" I considered the complexity of our shared history, the love that had once existed, the betrayals both large and small, the fundamental differences in values that had ultimately proven irreconcilable. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I'm open to finding out once all of this is truly behind us." It was the most I could offer, and Daniel accepted it with a nod of acknowledgement. We parted with an awkward half-embrace that symbolized our current state, neither fully connected nor completely estranged, navigating uncharted territory between our married past and separate futures. Daniel's testimony the following day was devastating to Rebecca's defense. With methodical precision, he outlined specific meetings where Rebecca had reviewed the actual efficacy data, acknowledged its inadequacy, and nevertheless directed the team to present more favorable figures to investors, regulators, and healthcare providers. He produced emails and text messages that contradicted her claims of ignorance, including one particularly damning exchange where she had written, "The board doesn't need to know about the Westlake discrepancies. Once we secure the contracts, we can address the performance issues quietly through updates." Rebecca's expression remained stone-faced throughout his testimony, but her attorney's increasingly desperate objections revealed the damage being done to their defense strategy. By the time Daniel stepped down from the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted perceptibly, from a contested narrative to what felt increasingly like the documentation of established facts. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Daniel, seeking additional comments about his testimony. He declined to elaborate, stating only that he had told the truth under oath and would continue to cooperate with investigators. The measured response reflected his evolution from corporate defender to reluctant but principled witness, a transformation parallel to but distinct from my own journey as a whistleblower. The prosecution rested its case the following day, having presented testimony from 17 witnesses and introduced over 300 documents as evidence. Rebecca's defense team called several character witnesses and technical experts who attempted to create alternative explanations for the discrepancies between reported and actual performance data. None effectively countered the documentary evidence, or the consistent testimony from former Meridian employees about Rebecca's direct knowledge and involvement. After 8 days of trial, the jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Rebecca showed no visible reaction as the forewoman read the decisions. maintaining the composed executive demeanor she had cultivated throughout her career. Only the slight whitening of her knuckles as she gripped the edge of the defense table betrayed her emotional response. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, releasing Rebecca on continued bail with restrictions on travel. Outside the courthouse, her attorney made a brief statement announcing their intention to appeal, claiming procedural errors and prejudicial evidence admission. Few legal analysts gave the appeal significant chances of success given the overwhelming documentary evidence presented at trial. That evening, as news coverage replayed highlights from the trial and legal experts debated the likely sentence, I sat alone in my apartment feeling strangely hollow. The verdict represented vindication, certainly, confirmation that my decision to come forward had been justified, that the evidence I had helped uncover was compelling beyond reasonable doubt. Yet there was no triumphant satisfaction, no sense that justice had fully healed the wounds created by this journey. Perhaps that was the nature of whistleblowing. The act itself changed you in ways that couldn't be reversed, even by the most definitive legal victory. I had lost my marriage, my financial security, my previous identity. I had gained purpose, clarity, and a new understanding of my own resilience. The accounting of that exchange couldn't be measured in courtroom victories or criminal sentences. My reflection was interrupted by a call from Sophia Martinez. "Congratulations," she said when I answered. "Your courage made this possible." "It wasn't just me," I reminded her. "So many people eventually spoke up. Dr. Clark, Mia Johnson, the hospital administrators. I was just the first domino." "Sometimes the first domino is the hardest to topple," Sophia observed. "I'm calling because the Observer wants to do a follow-up piece now that the verdict is in. Not focused on Meridian specifically, but on the broader issues of corporate accountability in healthcare and the challenges facing whistleblowers. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" I considered the request carefully. My natural inclination was to retreat from public view now that the legal process had validated my claims. Yet I recognized the potential value in sharing what I had learned, not just about Meridian's specific fraud, but about the systemic issues that enabled corporate misconduct to endanger patients. Yes, I decided, but I'd like to focus on solutions moving forward, not just what went wrong. There are structural changes needed to protect both patients and those who speak up about safety concerns. That's exactly the perspective we need, Sophia agreed. Not just exposing problems, but highlighting potential reforms. As I hung up, I realized the verdict wasn't an ending, but a transition point. The work I had begun by exposing Meridian's fraud would continue in new forms through the Oversight Committee, through public advocacy for stronger protections, through whatever professional path I ultimately chose to pursue. The painful journey had opened doors to purposeful work I might never have discovered otherwise. Later that night, I received a simple text from Daniel. "Justice served. Your father would be proud." The message crystallized what I had been feeling throughout this complex day. My father's influence had guided me through the darkest moments of this journey. His unwavering belief that truth mattered, that integrity wasn't negotiable, that genuine success could never be built on concealed wrongdoing. Those principles had cost me dearly, but had ultimately led to both legal vindication and personal growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Rebecca's sentencing, the Oversight Committee's recommendations, my evolving professional identity beyond the whistleblower label. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply acknowledge the distance traveled since that devastating moment when I'd received Daniel's text while at my father's funeral. The woman who had stood in that funeral home, shocked by betrayal and grief, had discovered capabilities and convictions she hadn't known she possessed. Whatever came next would be built on that hard-won foundation of self-knowledge and proven resilience. Not the life I had planned or expected, but increasingly one that felt authentically mine. 6 months after Rebecca Thompson's conviction, I stood at the podium in the Lakeside University Medical School auditorium, surveying the audience of healthcare administrators, patient safety advocates, and policy experts who had gathered for the inaugural conference on corporate ethics in healthcare technology. My journey from corporate whistleblower to keynote speaker had been unexpected, but somehow fitting. A transformation of painful experience into constructive expertise. The most dangerous phrase in healthcare isn't a medical term, I began. It's nobody will notice. Those 3 words justified data manipulation at Meridian Health Solutions. They rationalized the dismissal of troubling safety signals. They prioritized short-term profits over patient well-being. And they reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how integrity functions in complex systems. The audience listened intently as I outlined the patterns I had observed, not just at Meridian, but across multiple companies where similar issues had emerged in the wake of increased scrutiny following Meridian's exposure. Corporate fraud in healthcare isn't primarily about malicious intent, I continued. It's about incremental compromises that gradually normalize deception. It's about cultures where raising concerns is punished rather than rewarded. And most importantly, it's about broken accountability systems that place the burden of truth-telling on individual whistleblowers instead of institutional safeguards. My presentation wove together the technical aspects of Meridian's fraud with the human factors that had enabled it, the psychological pressure to meet investor expectations, the compartmentalization of information that allowed executives to maintain plausible deniability, the subtle ways that dissenting voices had been marginalized or silenced. As I concluded, I shifted from analysis to prescription. The solution isn't just stronger penalties after fraud is exposed. It's creating environments where speaking truth is safer than concealing it. It's implementing verification protocols that don't rely on corporate self-reporting. And most crucially, it's restructuring financial incentives so that patient safety and investor returns are aligned rather than opposed. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for me, I recognized, but for the broader movement toward accountability that had gained momentum since Meridian's practices were exposed. In the 18 months since I had first discovered the data manipulation, 5 other major healthcare technology companies had faced investigations for similar violations. Industry-wide standards for efficacy reporting had been strengthened. The FDA had established a specialized division focused on software safety in medical applications. After the presentation, a group of medical students approached with questions about ethical decision-making in corporate environments. Their earnest engagement reminded me of my own idealism before witnessing how easily corporate culture could erode individual integrity. Yet their awareness of these dynamics, their determination to enter their careers with eyes open to these pressures, gave me hope that the next generation might build more resilient systems. "How do you know when to speak up?" one student asked. "Where's the line between normal business optimization and ethical compromise?" I considered the question carefully, remembering my own gradual awakening to Meridian's transgressions. "Pay attention to justifications," I advised. "When you hear everyone does this, or it's just how the industry works, that's often the first warning sign. But the clearest indicator is considering the consequences of transparency. If revealing your actions would damage trust or create liability, you're already on the wrong side of that line." As the conference continued, I found myself in conversations with hospital administrators implementing new verification protocols for technology vendors, regulators developing more sophisticated oversight approaches, and patient advocates working to amplify the voices of those harmed by corporate negligence. Each interaction reinforced what had become increasingly clear. The significance of exposing Meridian's fraud extended far beyond one company or one whistleblower's experience. During the lunch break, my phone displayed a notification from a news app. Rebecca Thompson reports to federal prison to begin 6-year sentence. The headline prompted a complex emotional response, not satisfaction or vindication, but a somber acknowledgement of consequences properly aligned with actions. Rebecca had maintained her innocence through sentencing and denied wrongdoing even as she exhausted her appeals. Her final statement to the court had framed her as a victim of overzealous prosecution and disgruntled employees, without a hint of remorse for the patients put at risk by her decisions. James Peterson, who had cooperated extensively with prosecutors, had received a 3-year sentence. 4 other Meridian executives had accepted plea agreements with penalties ranging from probation to 18 months in prison. The human cost of corporate fraud extended beyond those harmed by the company's products to include careers destroyed and families disrupted by the consequences of collective ethical failures. Daniel had avoided prison through his cooperation, instead receiving 2 years of probation and a substantial fine. Our divorce had been finalized 3 months after Rebecca's conviction, concluded with a mediated settlement that acknowledged both the dissolution of our marriage and the complex financial entanglements created by Meridian's downfall and our opposing roles in its exposure. We had maintained limited contact since then, occasional text messages about practical matters, brief conversations when our paths crossed at events related to the Meridian case. The promised friendship remained more theoretical than actual, though the active hostility had faded into something like mutual respect for our different journeys through the shared catastrophe. After the conference concluded, I returned to my office at the Healthcare Technology Safety Institute, the independent nonprofit that had emerged from the oversight committee I had joined during Meridian's investigation. As executive director, for financial integrity, I led efforts to develop verification methodologies that would help healthcare facilities evaluate vendors' claims independently, rather than relying solely on company-provided data. The work combined my financial analysis background with the insights gained through whistleblowing, a career path I could never have anticipated, but that provided both professional fulfillment and the sense that my painful experience continued to yield constructive outcomes. The position also offered stability after months of financial uncertainty, allowing me to finally move from my temporary apartment to a small house overlooking the lake. As I reviewed reports on our latest verification protocol trial, my assistant notified me that Nathan Brooks, now the permanent CEO of Meridian Health Solutions, had called requesting a meeting. Under Nathan's leadership, Meridian had undergone comprehensive restructuring, replacing the entire executive team, implementing robust compliance protocols, and voluntarily exceeding the remediation requirements specified in their agreement with the Department of Justice. These efforts had gradually rehabilitated the company's reputation, though Meridian would likely operate under heightened scrutiny for years to come. Industry analysts had been surprised by the company's survival, having predicted bankruptcy after the fraud exposure. Instead, through transparent acknowledgement of past failures and demonstrable commitment to reform, Meridian had stabilized and begun rebuilding trust with healthcare providers and investors. I called Nathan back, curious about his request. "Emma, thank you for returning my call," he greeted me. "I'm reaching out because Meridian is developing a new patient safety monitoring system, and we'd like your institute to conduct the independent verification before we make any efficacy claims." The request represented a remarkable evolution, from the company that had once falsified data to inflate performance metrics. "That's a significant step toward transparency," I observed. "Are your investors comfortable with independent verification before marketing?" "They've accepted that it's the only sustainable approach," Nathan explained. "The old model of exaggerated claims followed by post-implementation patches is dead, at least for us. We've rebuilt our development process around documented efficacy rather than projected efficacy." We scheduled a meeting to discuss the verification protocols in detail, along with the appropriate firewalls to ensure the Institute's independence, despite Meridian funding the review. As I ended the call, I reflected on the distance traveled, both personally and institutionally, since my discovery of Meridian's fraud. The company that had attempted to destroy my reputation now sought my organization's validation, recognizing that genuine integrity offered the only viable path forward. That evening, as I walked along the lakeshore near my new home, my phone displayed Daniel's number. We hadn't spoken in several weeks, and I answered with curiosity rather than apprehension. "I saw you were the keynote at the Healthcare Ethics Conference," he said after brief pleasantries. "The recording is circulating widely in healthcare technology circles. It's making an impact." "That's good to hear," I replied. "The goal is systemic change, not just individual awareness." "You've always understood that better than most," Daniel acknowledged. "Listen, I'm calling because I'm relocating to Boston next month. I've accepted a position leading compliance implementation for a pharmaceutical startup, ensuring they build integrity into their operations from the beginning rather than treating it as an afterthought. The career move surprised me, not the compliance focus, which aligned with Daniel's recent professional evolution, but the geographic separation from Lakeside, where his professional network and reputation had been centered. "That sounds like meaningful work," I said. "Is the move primarily for the position, or are you looking for a fresh start away from the Meridian associations?" "Both," he admitted. "The role is perfect for my current skill set and priorities. But yes, I think we could both benefit from some geographical distance. Too many people here know us primarily through the lens of Meridian and the whistleblowing case." The assessment was perceptive. Despite my professional success since the case conclusion, social interactions in Lakeside remained colored by people's knowledge of the fraud exposure and my role in it. Some viewed me as heroic, others as disloyal, both perspectives reducing a complex ethical journey to simplistic narratives. "I think that's wise," I told him. "Fresh contexts allow for reinvention, based on current values rather than past associations." We talked for a few minutes more about practical matters related to our remaining shared property, artwork still in storage, the vacation timeshare we had never gotten around to liquidating in the divorce, before the conversation reached its natural conclusion. "Emma," Daniel said just before hanging up, "I want you to know that despite everything, I'm grateful for what happened. Not the fraud itself, obviously, but your courage in exposing it. It forced me to confront who I'd become and find a better path forward. I wouldn't have chosen this journey, but I'm better for having taken it." After we disconnected, I continued my walk along the lakeshore, considering Daniel's perspective. There was truth in his assessment. Painful experiences often catalyzed growth that would not have occurred otherwise. My own transformation from corporate spouse to whistleblower to patient safety advocate had required the crucible of Meridian's fraud exposure and its aftermath. The sun was setting over the water, casting long golden reflections across the gentle waves. I thought of my father, wondering what he would make of where life had taken me since his passing. The grief of losing him had intertwined with the discovery of Meridian's fraud, creating a pivotal moment when values and choices aligned to change the trajectory of my life completely. He would have understood the complexity of these transformations, how truth-telling could be simultaneously destructive and constructive, how integrity often exacted personal costs while creating broader benefits, how individual moral choices rippled outward to affect systems and institutions. Most importantly, he would have recognized that meaningful lives are rarely linear or predictable, but instead shaped by how we respond to unexpected challenges and opportunities. As darkness settled over the lake, I turned toward home, newly appreciative of the path that had led me here. Not the life I had planned when supporting Daniel's career at Meridian, certainly. Not the comfortable but constrained existence I had accepted as my role. But something more authentic, more impactful, and ultimately more aligned with my deepest values. The whistleblower's journey hadn't ended with Meridian's exposure or Rebecca's conviction. It continued through each conversation with healthcare administrators implementing stronger verification protocols, through each student considering ethical boundaries in corporate environments, through each company reconsidering the true costs of integrity shortcuts. It continued through my daily work at the Institute and through the gradual rebuilding of my personal life, apart from the whistleblower identity that had defined me during the investigation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the meeting with Nathan about Meridian's verification protocols, ongoing implementations of our safety frameworks at hospitals nationwide, preparations for upcoming congressional testimony on strengthening whistleblower protections. Each responsibility reflected not just the professional expertise I had developed, but the moral clarity that emerged only after witnessing the consequences of its absence. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, I would face them with the confidence of someone who had already navigated the most painful ethical crucible of her life and emerged stronger, clearer, and more purposeful. Not despite the experience of whistleblowing, but because of it. Because once you've stood alone for truth against powerful opposition, ordinary challenges lose their power to intimidate. As I reached my front porch, I paused to look back at the darkening lake once more. The path forward wasn't perfectly clear or guaranteed, but it was genuinely mine, shaped by choices made with integrity, even when those choices carried steep personal costs. In the ongoing calculation between comfort and conscience, I had discovered which I valued more. That knowledge, hard-won through the Meridian ordeal, would illuminate whatever journey came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.